You guys hear me on this? Okay, wait, don't leave. So Paul also asked for an outro. It turns out that Paul was nominated for the 2022 Best Alum from Whammy. Did I get that right?
Yes.
2022 Best Alum from Whammy. So thank you all for being here. Thank you, Paul, for that introduction. Thank you to Sheila and to Chris for the opportunity to be here. And thanks to all of you for spending the next 35, 40 minutes with me. As Paul said, my name is Mark. I am currently the Chief Medical Officer for Mercy Ships, which I will explain to you what Mercy Ships is about halfway through my talk. And I'm also a lecturer in global health and social medicine at the Harvard Medical School. And I've entitled my talk, Solving for Why, which is a phrase that I'll explain in about 9 minutes. But what Paul and Sheila had asked me to talk about was a little bit of a meditation, a little bit of an exploration of how we as a profession, how we as individuals can navigate this really strange space that our profession is in. Right, we're coming out of a pandemic. First time that y'all are meeting in person in 3 years. Coming out of a pandemic, but we're not quite out of it yet. We have rising cases and RSV and flu, and we've got some people saying, look, the last 3 years were traumatic, we need to put them aside and just go back to the way things were in 2019. We've got other people saying, oh my gosh, the new normal should be 2020, and we've got people all the way in between. How do we navigate this when particularly our professions have been fundamentally and maybe irrevocably altered by the last 2.5 years? What are the ways that we can think about how to navigate the next 2.5 years, the next 5 years as a profession and as individuals? So that's what I want to talk about today. A little bit of housekeeping. I get consulting fees from Global Surgery Advisors that have absolutely nothing to do with this talk. As Paul has already mentioned, I do have a book. I have to disclose it here. The book is called Solving for Why. The concepts in the book, Paul has read actually some of them. Concepts in the book are in this talk. Concepts in the talk are in the book. This is not a book talk. There are no books available in the back. This is the last time I'm going to mention the book. Other than that, I have no other relevant financial interests that would create a conflict of interest for CME purposes. Okay, so let's get started. I'd like you to think back to 2019. Now, 2019 feels like it was about a generation ago, but it wasn't that long ago. 2019 was the year that Notre Dame burned, and it still hasn't been rebuilt. This was Notre Dame literally this past weekend, so this was not that long ago. 2019 was the year that a gunman shot up and killed 51 people at a mosque in Christchurch and live streamed it. 2019 was the year that another gunman shot up UNC Charlotte, that Alberta caught on fire, that tornadoes tore through Texas and Arkansas, causing millions of dollars in damage. A little bit less depressingly, 2019 was the year that Game of Thrones ended. Y'all remember, that was like a month-long controversy after that finale. So we got to the end of 2019, and it felt like we were standing at a threshold. It felt like we were putting a bow around a foundational year, a year that was kind of difficult, a year with some difficult things that happened in it. Putting a bow around that year and looking forward to 2020 with a lot of hope. And then 2020 happened. It started with intimations of World War III with Iraq and Iran in January of 2020. And then in February, the entire continent of Australia caught on fire. Then there were murder hornets. Then there was a newly discovered comet that some people told us was an omen, and you know what? After these last 2.5 years, they were probably right. Then there were zombie cicadas. Then George Floyd and Breonna Taylor were murdered. And then there were protests and counter-protests. And then there was that really weird event in front of a church with tear gas. And then there was Harvey Weinstein and Jeffrey Epstein and Prince Andrew and pedophile sex rings. And then there were firenados in California and derechos in the Midwest. Then there was a double hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico that we haven't seen in 130 years. Then the skies on the West Coast turned into Blade Runner. Then there were rumors that Kim Jong-un was dead and his sister was running the country. Then there was the longest election night ever. And then a whole bunch of people stormed the Capitol, breaching it for the first time since 1846, getting minutes away from the vice president, only to be stopped by this one Capitol security guard. It goes on. Then Burma fell apart. There was a coup in Burma. Then Texas froze. Then the Ever Given got stuck in the Suez Canal. And then we flew a drone on a different planet. And then Ethiopia fell apart. And now we've come full circle to intimations of World War III with what's happening in Ukraine. That is a lot of stuff to have happened in 2.5 years. And underpinning all of that, underpinning every one of those newsworthy events, was COVID. Depending on which studies you read, between 6 and 18 million people have died, and over 650 million people have been infected by a virus that spreads through our face holes, and we are at each other's throats about what to do with those face holes, or vaccines, or distancing, or anything else. We have seen over the last 2.5 years our colleagues furloughed and fired. We've seen our salaries cut. We've seen our retirement funds dipped into. And at the same time, we have seen insurance companies double their profits and billionaires make over $1 trillion since the start of this pandemic. I don't know about you, but there have been times over the last 2.5 years where it's felt like a full frontal assault on the things that brought us into medicine in the first place. The things like caring for other people, like science, like rationality. And yet, there is an unspoken assumption that as providers, what we have to do is show up day in and day out, keep our heads down, don't ask any questions, all for the sake of our patients. This article is an op-ed in the New York Times in 2019, before the pandemic happened, 6 weeks after Notre Dame burned. It's an op-ed by Danielle Offrey, who's a physician in New York City. And she makes the compelling case that the very business of our profession depends on us keeping our heads down, not asking any questions, and showing up day in and day out. And we continue to do it. Most physicians, she says, remain committed to the ethics that brought them into the field in the first place. An overwhelming majority of doctors and nurses do the right thing for their patients, even at high personal costs. Now listen, I work in global health right now. I have worked in countries at the end of their civil wars, and I don't think I've experienced a time of higher personal cost to ourselves, to our families, to our physical health, to our mental health. How many of you remember this obituary in 2020 of Lorna Breen, the director of the emergency department at the Allen Pavilion in the northern part of Manhattan, who took her own life because she could not come to grips with the patients in her emergency department that shouldn't have been dying, but were dying of a disease that she and the rest of us had no idea how to treat. My ex is an ICU doctor, and so many times she would say, there are patients in my unit that are dying that shouldn't be dying. What a toll this takes on us and has taken on us. This study came out right after the first wave of the COVID pandemic, and it showed that 1 in 5 clinicians met clinical criteria for depression. Just last week, a study came out showing that just in 2021, 117,000 physicians have left the profession. That is 5 years of graduating med school classes, all retired in 1 year. Last month, The Atlantic published a piece by Ed Young claiming that 300,000 nurses have left the profession since the start of the pandemic. I'm giving you all this not to depress you, but to tell you that our profession has been changed by this pandemic. Our profession has been altered by this pandemic, and we have a choice right now. We have a choice to continue to show up day in and day out, keep our heads down, not ask any questions. We have a choice to go back to 2019 and just sort of ignore the fundamental change that's happened in our profession. Or I think we can take this opportunity, the place that we are right now, to not show up day in and day out before we ask some questions. Take this opportunity to understand what we want to do with this. When I started writing this talk, I started writing a very different talk. Burnout is a huge topic in conversation. I started writing a talk about burnout. And it was a talk about the way to navigate ourselves through burnout was to keep the main thing, to keep the humanity of our patients at the center of our decisions. And I think that's a really important thing to talk about. But as I started working on that talk, it started to feel glib. It started to feel like just another talk that's encouraging you to keep your head down, show up day in and day out for your patients. It's a talk like the ones that you've for sure heard that ask doctors to, do more yoga to get out of burnout. And I realized as I was writing that talk that I did want to give a talk about keeping humanity at the center of our decisions, but the humanity that I wanted to talk about was not necessarily the patient's, it was our own. I think we have the opportunity right now in this threshold that we are in to look to our own humanity, keep our own humanity at the center, and navigate with that through this threshold. It's an opportunity to use the words at the start of this talk to solve for why. So, I've now used that phrase twice, and I haven't explained to you what it means. To explain to you what it means, I'm going to show you a video. This is a video by a stand-up comedian named Michael Jr. Michael Jr. does great stand-up comedy. He's clean. You can watch him with your family. He's given me kind permission to use this video in this talk. And what Michael Jr. does is in the middle of his stand-up acts, he sits down and he talks randomly with members of his audience. And he calls these times break times. So this is a break time with Michael Jr. in 2016.
Brother, right there. Yeah. What's your name, bro?
Daryl.
I'm gonna need you to slow down with all that, bro. For real, you're scaring the white people. You can't do that, Daryl.
I'm sorry, bro.
You're scaring me too, though. Wow. Well, what do you do for a living, Daryl?
I work at Oak Ridge Military Academy. I'm the music director there.
Musical director at Oak Ridge Musical Academy. Okay.
Yeah.
But you got a deep voice, man. I would not want to get you mad. Jonathan, come here. You're like, oh, snap. 9 Jonathans show up. It's amazing, dude. So you're a musical director. Cool.
Yes, sir.
All right, so let me get a couple bars of like Amazing Grace. Can you do the first part of that? Let me hear. We didn't plan this. Just so y'all know, we didn't plan this at all. I'm just randomly talking. Go ahead.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.
Wow.
That bro could sing. You know what I'm saying?
All right. Now, what you give me the version is if your uncle just got out of jail, you got shot in the back when you was a kid. I'm just saying, let me see the hood version real quick, if you know which version I'm talking about. Just see if that exists. Let me see what you got.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Found, was blind, but now I see.
I have seen this video probably 300 times at this point, and I still get the chills the second time that Daryl sings Amazing Grace. But here's the thing. Daryl didn't become a better singer between the first and second times that he sang Amazing Grace. He didn't gain any new musical talents or get a better ear or learn the words to a song he's probably sung a million times. The difference between the first time that Daryl sang Amazing Grace, which was impressive, and the second time, which was inspiring, is that between the first and the second times that Daryl sang Amazing Grace, Michael Jr. gave him a why. And importantly, that why had nothing to do with the audience he was singing for. That why was inside him. Let me see if that's in there, Michael Jr. said. And the difference in the audience's reaction, my reaction, and maybe your reaction to the second time that Daryl sings Amazing Grace, is tied absolutely to that one change, to the fact that the second time that Daryl sang Amazing Grace, he had a why. One of my favorite books is by Viktor Frankl. Frankl survived the Nazi concentration camps in World War II, and he wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and in it, he quotes Nietzsche, saying, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." If we're honest with our trainees, medical training, residency, medical school, all about learning how to bear all sorts of hows. Sometimes going to work every day, going to clinic every day, dealing with insurance companies, dealing with medical legal stuff, workplace politics, all about learning to bear all sorts of hows. This pandemic has been all about learning to bear all sorts of hows that we never signed up for. The question that I'd like to ask you tonight, the question I think we need to ask ourselves if we want to navigate this threshold that we are on with our humanity at the center, is what is the why for which you are bearing all of those hows? Now, as I've kind of alluded to, because each of these whys is intensely personal, because Michael Jr.'s why and Daryl's why is different from mine, is different from yours, I am going to tell you my story of solving for why, not because I think that story has any particular uniqueness to it, but because as I've talked to more and more people who have been on this path, a number of lessons keep coming up. And so I'm going to tell this story in 3 chapters. Chapter 1's by far the longest. Tell the story in 3 chapters with a lesson at the end of each chapter. So chapter 1, for me, my story starts with a car wreck. Now, if you can help it, try not to get into a car accident in Liberia because it kind of changes your life. This was 2008. This is the first time that I was living and working as a head and neck surgeon in a sub-Saharan African country. I was living in Monrovia, pictured here. And this particular weekend, about 20 of us expats wanted to go from Monrovia to a beach town about 3 hours to the northwest called Robertsport. Now, the drive from Monrovia to Robertsport is fairly simple. It requires one direction change. About an hour north of Monrovia, you turn left. The road from Monrovia north to that left-hand turn in 2008 was paved. The road west from that left-hand turn to Robertsport in 2008 was a single-track red dirt road, pretty flat, pretty well-maintained, but punctuated by these rickety wooden bridges over ravines. So 20 of us hired 5 taxis. I'm using that word very generously. This is 2008. Liberia has just come out of 2 back-to-back civil wars. There are still UN peacekeeping forces on the streets. The infrastructure in the country had not yet rebuilt. So they were bright yellow cars like you saw on that last slide, but they didn't have fully contiguous floorboards. You could see the road underneath your feet. And they were driven by people who couldn't have been more than 18, 19, or 20 years old. And I suspect some of you in here have sons who are 18, 19, 20 years old. And you know that the deal with young men in cars is that we like to go fast. So the minute we turned left onto that red dirt road, they took off. And those of us in the cars were absolutely egging them on. It was a weekend away. We were away from the hospital ship, away from Monrovia, going to a beach town. The wind was in most people's hair. And so... So we go to the Mon, and the car that I was in, the car that I and my friends were in, made it to the front of the pack. And what he would do, what that driver would do, is on the straight parts of the road, he would book it as fast as he could. And then he knew where the bridges were, so he'd stop at the bridge, slow down, take the bridge responsibly, and then book it again to the next bridge. You can kind of see where this is going. You drive down a dirt road really fast, stop all of a sudden, you kick up a whole bunch of dust behind you. The car behind us didn't see us, smashed right into us, and we fell off the bridge and into the ravine. Now, they say that time slows down, And it does. It's been nearly 15 years since this accident, and I can still see the ground slowly coming to hit the windshield. And I remember thinking, I guess this is how I die. I'm all right with that. The ground hit the windshield. The car was totaled. Thankfully, none of us was totaled. We escaped with some scrapes and bruises. A Pakistani contingent of those UN peacekeeping forces was traveling down the road the other direction. They saw what happened. They gathered us up, made sure we were okay, gave us some tea, packed us into the other 4 cars. We made it to Robertsport for the weekend and made it back to Monrovia for work the next morning. There's been some really cool research about this time dilation, this slowing down of time that happens in catastrophic and near-death experiences. Arstila in Finland thinks that this time dilation is due to an immediate up-ramping of the normal cognitive processes that happen in our brains every day. That may be due to the release of one of 14 different neurotransmitters that are released in our brains en masse right at the moment of death. But there's a second school of thought. Stetson and his colleagues think that none of this is true, and that this time dilation is an ex post facto misremembering of the events of the catastrophic or near-death experience. It's a really fascinating area of research. And if you have 5 minutes, look up Stetson's 2006 paper where he showed this, because the experiment they designed is supremely elegant. Supremely elegant experiments, very fascinating stuff, but to some degree it didn't matter to me. Because that thought, this is how I die and I'm okay with it, that thought stuck with me for the 2 days in Robertsport and has continued to stick with me for the 15 years since. And the reason I know now that I was okay with it was that because by then I had started to solve for why. The road there, though, was not straight. I never wanted to be a doctor. Like, actively, adamantly resisted being a doctor. I have terrible handwriting. So the adults around me when I was a kid would be like, oh, he's going to be a doctor. And I'd say, no, I don't want to be a doctor. I want to be a rock star. Because what little boy doesn't want to be a rock star? Or, no, I don't want to be a doctor. I want to be a philosopher. Because what little boy doesn't want to be a philosopher? But I grew up in a religious household. I grew up reading the stories of missionaries, of people like Bruce Olson, Hudson Taylor, Jim Elliot. And what I really wanted to be was a linguist. I was going to be that guy that was going to disappear into the jungles of Papua New Guinea, and specifically Papua New Guinea, create the writing system for a language that had at that point not been written, translate the Bible and maybe some Shakespeare into it, and emerge when my work was done. But I'm also the firstborn son of an immigrant family. And as any firstborn sons of immigrant families know, we have 3 options: doctor, lawyer, or failure. Didn't want to go into the law. I liked biology, so I went to school, majored in biology, and 95% of the kids graduating from my biology class ended up in med school. And because I couldn't be a rock star or a philosopher or a linguist, I had no reason not to follow them. So I did. I went to med school, and I hated it. I tried to quit after my first month. Ended up quitting after my first year, moving from Texas, where I was in med school, to Singapore to put 9,700 miles between me and medicine. I moved to Singapore to be a teacher, loved that year so much that at the end of it, I walked to the immigration building, fully intending to apply for permanent residency to keep 9,700 miles between me and medicine. Walked up to that building, walked around the block that it was on, a little bit like Joshua at Jericho, finally gathered the courage to put my hand on the door handle, chickened out, let go, went back home, went back to hating medical school. Went back to hating it so much that when it came time to pick a residency, I had no idea what I wanted to do because I didn't want to be in this endeavor in the first place. So I figured the wisest way to pick a residency would be to choose something that would let me work as little as possible, make as much money as possible, so that I could do all the other things that I wanted to do in my life, like, be a linguist or a rock star. And that specialty was ENT. It turns out that's not the wisest way to pick a specialty. I got to residency with Paul, and Paul will tell you, our residency was not the kindest place to be. But I think I hated it even more because I just didn't want to be there in the first place. I wanted to be done with this medicine thing in the first place. The way our residency was structured, we got to our head and neck, our surgical oncology rotations towards the end. And I got to those, and I was like, all right, this is not so bad. The anatomy of the head and neck is really pretty. Cancer is an interesting disease. I like the patients. I'm going to go ahead and do a head and neck fellowship. I'm going to get to that head and neck fellowship in chapter 2, but I decided at that point to do a head and neck fellowship because I figured after all these years, I had no other marketable skills besides medicine, so I had to find a way to make medicine work, so I went on to do a head and neck fellowship. But I'll get to that in chapter 2. Let me pause here and point out that there's a pattern that's kind of emerged in this first chapter. It's a pattern of starting something and not working, starting something else and failing at it, starting something else and failing at it. I went to med school, didn't thrive in med school, so I moved to Singapore to start a new life for myself and failed at doing that. Went back to residency, and as Paul can tell you, did not thrive in residency. And this pattern of starting something and failing it, and starting something else and it not working, it's a pattern that you will find in every person's story who's trying to keep the why at the center of their decisions. It's a pattern that's increased in my life since then. I maintain 2 folders, for example, on my computer, one of unfunded research grant applications and one of funded research grant applications, which is literally 15 times smaller. Don't hire me to write your grants. Up until about 2 years ago when I broke my knee, as Paul said, I used to compete on American Ninja Warrior. And Ninja Warrior is an exercise in putting yourself into a place where you will fail. Oh, nice! One of my other favorite authors is Thomas Merton. Merton writes, "Do not depend on the hope of results. You may have to face the fact that your work will be apparently worthless or even achieve results opposite to what you expect. As you get used to this idea, you start more and more to concentrate not on the results, but on the value, the rightness, and the truth of the work itself. Do not depend on the hope of results, which is literally what we are trained to depend on in medicine. As surgeons, we will console ourselves when we have a complication by saying, you know what, the only surgeon without complications is a surgeon who doesn't operate enough. And I think that's true. But our results-focused American psyche will not allow us to apply that same grace to our own lives. I told you just now that the reason that I went to do a head and neck fellowship was because I felt like I had no other marketable skills besides medicine, and so I had to make it work. I do think that's true, but if I can be honest with you all here, the real reason I went to do a head and neck fellowship was because I was afraid. I was afraid that if I stepped off that moving sidewalk that Paul was reading about, if I stepped off that prefab path of medicine, that path that basically takes us from college all the way to retirement, with some variability, we all follow the same path in medicine. And if I was going to step off of that, then I was going to have a life that would be apparently worthless or achieve results opposite to what I expect. The first step in navigating where we are right now as a profession, intentionally, with our why at the center and with some grace, is to find ways to fall in love with failure. And I'm using that phrase really, really particularly. I don't mean just sort of accept that failure exists, that the road to success is paved with a lot of failure. I don't mean yogaing yourself through failure or gritting your teeth through failure or any of that stuff. I actually mean push yourself to court failure, to woo failure. Put yourself in positions where you will fail. It is not something we are used to doing as clinicians. Put yourself in positions where you are courting failure, because failure does 2 things for us. One, it starts to push us against the edges of this moving sidewalk that we all find ourselves on. One of the things with this moving sidewalk, whether you like it or you hate it, is that you're really good at it. We know how to do our day-to-day life. We know how to meet its demands. When you're failing at something, it's an indication that you don't know yet what you're doing. So putting yourself in positions where you will fail pushes you against that moving sidewalk. And the second thing that it does, relatedly, is it starts to break that idolatry of the hope of results. If you want to navigate the next 2.5 years in medicine, putting results at the center is just going to repeat everything that we've been doing for the last 2.5 years. So, lesson number 1, fall in love with failure. Chapter 2. I went from New York to Toronto to do a head and neck fellowship, and I actually liked that fellowship. Still like head and neck cancer, still like the anatomy, even started to fall in love with that really cold city of Toronto. And as Paul said, went back to do a second fellowship in microvascular reconstructive surgery. But in between those 2 fellowships, I took a second year off. I moved to Monrovia in 2008 to work as a head and neck surgeon on a hospital ship where that car accident happened. I worked and still work with this organization called Mercy Ships. Mercy Ships is an NGO that, if you haven't encountered them before, you can kind of guess by this picture and by their name. They respond to a lack of access of surgery in resource-constrained settings through a bit of a unique platform. They deliver surgery, research, infrastructure development, training, advocacy from the decks of hospital ships. This is the ship that I was on in 2008 when that car wreck happened. This is the Africa Mercy. She's a 500-foot-long converted Danish rail ferry. She's 8 decks tall. The 3rd deck is the hospital deck. On that hospital deck, there are 75 patient beds. There's 5 operating rooms, a 4-bed ICU, 5-bed PACU. There's pathology. There's speech pathology. There's rehab. There's a CAT scanner, pharmacy, basically anything that you would want to deliver high-quality care here, just packaged onto a ship and docked off the coast of sub-Saharan African countries for 1 or 2 years at a time. And I could spend an hour, I won't, but I could spend an hour talking to you about the data behind the lack of access to surgery in resource-constrained settings. The fact that 71% of the world's population can't get surgery if they need it. The fact that 81 million people, 10 times the population of New York City, are pushed into poverty every year by the costs of getting their surgery. The fact that we need 2.3 million more surgical providers to be trained to meet the unmet need. I could give you that talk. I could also give you the talk of the privilege it is to walk Patricia and Samani from here to here. I love giving these talks because these talks are my own personal why. But we don't find our why in talks like this. We don't find our why in numbers and in data. We aren't logicked into or reasoned into or dated into our why. Our why comes from those quiet, numinous moments that each of us has in our lives if we listen to them. The Bosnian author Alexander Hamon writes, "There are moments in life when it is all turned inside out, when what is real becomes unreal, what is unreal becomes tangible, and all your level-headed efforts to keep tight ontological control are rendered silly and indulgent." What better description of our profession in the last 2.5 years than that last phrase? Level-headed efforts to keep tight ontological control over ourselves, over our career paths, over our results, over the behavior of others in the middle of a pandemic. Yet our why doesn't come when we have tight ontological control. It comes when what is real becomes unreal, and what is unreal becomes tangible. As Paul foreshadowed, that event happened for me the first time I walked onto that hospital ship. Walked down the red stairs at the front of that hospital ship. Took a right-hand turn, left-hand turn, into the maxillofacial and head and neck tumor ward. Saw a dozen head and neck tumor patients at various stages in recovery. And as Paul said, it hit me. This is what I have been training for the last 15 years to do. The second step in finding your why is to listen. The second step is to find those quiet, numinous moments. They're getting harder and harder to find as our political discourse gets more fractious. The 24-hour news cycle is constantly bombarding us. Take the time to listen to those quiet, numinous moments. Take the time, again, from what Paul read from Maya Angelou. Take the time to let choice whisper in your ear. Let love murmur in your heart. Be ready and listen. Chapter 3. You would think that a road to Damascus moment like that would change my life forever, but as you've probably picked up so far, I'm not a very brave man. So I came back from Africa, went right back onto that moving sidewalk, finished my fellowship, got a post as an academic head and neck surgeon at a big city hospital in Boston. Got there and was like, ooh, that sucks. And for the majority of my training, I had been told, I'm sure you all have heard this too, I'd been told, stick it out, it gets better, it gets better, it gets better. And they're right, it gets better. Being an attending, way better than being a resident. But I got to better. I got to better and I looked around and I was like, this is not what I signed up for. How many times have you heard that phrase in the last 2.5 years? This is not what we signed up for. And I was not alone in this. These data are a little bit old. They come from a survey in 2008 of primarily primary care physicians, 12,000 physicians, only 6% of whom feel their colleagues have good morale. 78% said medicine was no longer rewarding. 45% would have retired that day if they could, and half planned to retire or reduce patient care in the next 3 years. That's 2008. 2022 doesn't look really any better. A third of physicians plan to leave the profession in the next 18 months, and of those, half of them will leave medicine altogether. Between 60 and 90% of physicians would not recommend medicine as a career to somebody coming out of college. The problem gets worse. Medicine is the second most suicidal occupation in the nation, and suicide is the second most common cause of death among medical students, second only to accidents and trauma. This year alone, between 300 and 400 doctors will commit suicide, which is twice the rate of the national population. And my colleagues across the ether screen, male anesthesiologists, are the most at risk. On the flip side, burnout, which we've been talking about a lot, I hear this weekend, burnout, as you all know, primarily, not exclusively, but primarily is the purview of female physicians. Suicide here is the purview of male physicians. In either direction, there's some bad stuff happening in our profession. And yet, people keep coming in. In the 6 years covered by this study, the physician workforce grew 12%, which is faster than the population growth in the country. So people keep flocking into our profession, getting into our profession, looking around, making it to better, and being like, that's not what I signed up for. Now, obviously, job dissatisfaction is not just the purview of those of us who work in medicine. Of the 156 million employees in the US, 70% dislike their jobs, primarily those who work in the private sector. For them, a job is just something to do, to bring money home, to put food on the table, and not something that gives them a purpose or a sense of meaning. Okay, so against that slightly depressing backdrop, I went back to Africa, started talking to this man here, a man who's become a mentor and a friend. His name is Gary Parker. He's been working on these hospital ships as a surgeon for 36 years. And I asked Gary, how does he make difficult decisions in his life when he is standing at a threshold, when he has to make a hard decision? What process does he use to make that decision? Now, as Paul said, I've since gone back to school. I have a degree in decision making, so I know that Gary's answer has a name. It's called the Maximax or Optimist Criterion for Decision Making Under Uncertainty, or the Gary Parker Rule. And the Gary Parker Rule is this: when Gary faces a big decision in his life, he looks 30 years down the road at each of his two options, at the best possible outcome of each of his two options. And if one of those best possible outcomes makes him think, meh, then it's not the right choice for him, because he would spend 30 years pursuing something that at the best would just make him think, meh. Now, as a decision analyst, I like trees and numbers, so let's formalize the Gary Parker Rule. Let's say you're facing a decision. You're facing, how do I want to live the next 5 years of my clinical life? Well, to make that decision following the Gary Parker Rule, you find the best possible outcome of each of your two choices, and then you choose the best of the best. This is a really rare decision-making paradigm because it's incredibly risky. We tend not to make decisions this way. The reason that falling in love with failure is lesson number one is because very often the worst possible outcome is in choice B. So I came back from this conversation with Gary, and I started applying the Gary Parker rule to my own life. What would it look like for 30 years for me to be an academic head and neck surgeon at some big city hospital somewhere in the US? I would have treated 10,000 patients maybe. Half of them would have lived, half of them would have died, because that was what head and neck cancer was at that time, and I would retire with a nice house and a Jaguar. And for me, that was not satisfying. I've said this multiple times. Every one of these is an intensely personal decision. My partner, the guy who hired me, the guy that I operated with, for him being the best surgeon that he could be, that absolutely drove him. That was his why, but it wasn't mine. I knew then that I had to move from the care of individual patients in the US to the care of patients and populations in resource-constrained settings. It took me a couple more years to do that, but this brings me to the very last lesson. You can fall in love with failure all you want. You can listen to the quiet, numinous moments all you want, and you should be doing both of those. But once you hear the why, you've got to do something about it. The listening doesn't matter if you don't act on it. The third lesson, the third step in navigating this space with intentionality, with grace, and with our own humanity at the center is to make the intentional decisions to follow that why. Thomas Merton, to close us out, a man knows when he has found his vocation, when he stops thinking about how to live, stops thinking about how to endure all sorts of hows, and begins to live. To navigate this space, do three things. Find ways to fall in love with the feeling of being a beginner. Find time to listen for those quiet, numinous moments, and then when you hear them, make the scary, intentional decisions about your why. Now listen, 95% of us will go through an exercise like this and we'll come out the other side and say, yeah, I signed up to be a healer. I'm all in. This is what I want to do. 5% of us might not. 5% of us might come out the other side like I did and think, no, this is not what I want to do. Either direction, we will have done it honestly and with intention. And whatever your why is, my prayer to you is that you live it well. Thank you very much.